Whether a precocious elementary schooler or a senior waiting to leave for college, all of us kids in Plainfield found ourselves counting down the days until Mescaloon's mobile cinema rolled back into town. There were no advertisements for it posted anywhere, especially not the public notice boards at the library or the town hall. Nor were particular return dates announced after the last screening. Nor did the mobile cinema have a set schedule by which to calibrate our internal clocks. We would always learn of its return from a rumor. Somebody would mention hearing of a showing 2 towns over, meaning our turn would come tomorrow night, or else someone would have heard on good authority from a friend of a friend that Plainfield would be the next town on the circuit, making next weekend the one we'd all been waiting for. And sure enough, one of those rumors would be true. We'd gather in the fields at the edge of town, and there would be Mr. Mescaloon himself, dressed in his tattered top hat and patchwork tuxedo, standing outside the modified trailer that contained the rarest movie house in the world. We would enter through the back of the trailer, if we were one of the lucky few to be admitted. Inside, the trailer contained a few rows of metal folding chairs welded to the floor, with a narrow aisle stretching down the middle. The chairs faced a stark white wall, onto which a projector dangling from the ceiling would beam whatever film Mr. Mescaloon had to show us. They were always worth seeing. Everyone. Because you could see nothing like them anywhere else. Maybe we were biased, since Plainfield didn't have a movie theater of its own. Or a roller rink. Or an arcade. Or anywhere else for kids to go for entertainment. Our parents weren't big on such things. All the same, long after some of us had left Plainfield for greener pastures and had seen the kinds of movies everybody else had enjoyed, we had to admit that nothing was ever as exciting as the films of Mr. Mescaloon. We never knew exactly what to expect going in for a screening. Sometimes his films were no more than 10 minutes long, others ran for over 3 hours. We could never recognize the actors and actresses on screen, partially because we never had the chance to learn about and grow enamored of movie stars through magazines and gossip rags, since anything not a textbook would be confiscated at school. Mostly, though, it was because Mr. Mescaloon's films used no professional actors. Maybe he picked them for their looks, or for the sounds of their voices, maybe his casting selections had no logic whatsoever. It didn't matter. The actors always showed real emotion in his films, no matter how large or small the role. You could tell they were giving it everything they had. You'd be forgiven for thinking they weren't faking. You could be sure of only one thing when you sat down to watch one of Mr. Mescaloon's films: somebody was going to die. Their death wouldn't always be gory. Sure, there were the bloody ones, the machete to the skull, the 1,000 strategic cuts of the razor, the gunshot at close range. Sometimes they went cleanly, girded by a masked figure, for instance, or left twitching in a chair after drinking a glass of something toxic. Whatever the method, no matter how creative, the filmed death would be more realistic than you could imagine. And so too would be the performance leading up to it, the tears, the pleas, the screams. That, we thought, was the chief virtue of Mr. Mescaloon's films. How real they were. How true they were. Having endured the blandness and falsehood of the whitewashed novels and television shows our parents forced on us, it felt as if we were seeing the world as it was meant to be seen for the first time in our lives. It was like being born, or reborn. We were all grateful to Mr. Mescaloon for it. We greeted the end of each film with a standing ovation, and Mr. Mescaloon, ever modest, would doff his grungy hat and give us a low bow. We never told our parents about Mr. Mescaloon. Not only because it would entail revealing that we had sneaked out of our rooms at night, and violated our curfews. We predicted that they'd claim he was the devil, like they had with our trading card games and fantasy anthologies, and prohibit us from ever visiting him again. He never charged us money for admission to his screenings. All he asked is that we enter his lottery. To each kid he admitted into the trailer, he provided a paper raffle ticket with a handwritten number on it. Once the film ended and our applause subsided, he'd reach into his hat and fish around inside until his gloved hand emerged holding a slip of paper. He'd read the number in his quiet, soothing voice, and check whether any of our tickets matched it. If none did, he would simply smile, shake hands with anybody who stayed behind to thank him for the show, and let us out into the moonlit fields, where the lingering crowd of the curious unadmitted anxiously questioned us about what we had seen. For several years, we did not know what would happen if one held a matching ticket. Then there came the night when Chris P. won the drawing. Mr. Mescaloon reached into his hat like usual, and we scarcely paid attention, accustomed as we were to the slim odds of having the right number. When he announced the winner, half of us didn't even bother to glance at our tickets. Calm as ever, Mr. Mescaloon repeated the number. That was when Chris, sitting in the front row, raised his hand. It was as if lightning had struck us, and melded us to our seats. This was something even more unprecedented than the films we came to see. We started clapping, and Chris stood and nodded to us politely as Mr. Mescaloon came over to congratulate him. All of us were eager to learn what Chris's prize would be, but Mr. Mescaloon sent us on our way, keeping only Chris behind. Some of us waited outside the trailer for a long time afterward, but nobody emerged. Given the late hour, we had to head home, lest our families awaken and discover we weren't where we should have been. Chris's absence from school the following day surprised nobody. Who wouldn't take the day off after staying out so late? When he didn't appear the day after, we were perplexed. Once an entire week elapsed, we were downright curious. Even so, we didn't dare tell an adult. What would become of the mobile cinema once they learned of it? For that matter, what would become of us? We didn't glimpse Chris again until the next time Mescaloon's mobile cinema parked in the outskirts of town. Those of us who gained entry waited eagerly for the projector to warm up and give us what we needed to see. And when it finally flickered to life, dust motes swirling and sparkling in its beam, we beheld none other than Chris P. on the screen before us, sitting shirtless against a concrete wall. We erupted into thunderous applause. Our friend looked more alive on film than he ever had on the streets of Plainfield. He looked up at the camera and stared forward, as if he were looking into each of our eyes. He knew who we were, after all, he knew we'd be there, watching, enjoying. We could feel that he dedicated this performance to us. He opened and closed his mouth a few times, tentatively, as though he had a monologue to recite, but couldn't remember any of his lines. After a few attempts, he clenched his jaw, and fixed his gaze someplace beyond the camera. It was like he looked through us at that point. Like we were transparent. Or like we were ghosts. Like something that didn't exist anymore, because we weren't real enough to be worth acknowledging. A shadow fell over the frame from the foreground, climbing up Chris's face. At first, he stayed expressionless, resigned or stoic or simply refusing to emote. Then a low rumbling burbled over the speakers. Soon it gave way to a loud, unmistakable whir, the sound of a readied chainsaw. The tears began to stream from Chris's eyes, as if they had a life independent of him. In another minute, the rest of him had caught up, and his body began to shake as he broke into convulsive sobs. A figure wearing all black, with face obscured beneath a black ski mask, entered the frame. A chainsaw rattled in the figure's gloved hands. Chris regarded the newcomer, and murmured something inaudible beneath the chainsaw's whine. The words weren't important, anyway. He could have narrated a shopping list, and it would have seemed imbued with purpose and meaning and vitality. He had us riveted. The figure raised the chainsaw over Chris's head. Our friend closed his eyes, trembling. The blade lowered toward his neck. The figure fainted once, twice. Then, in one powerful downward swing, the chainsaw bit into Chris's spine. He yelped, but the sound was cut short as the blade did its work. His head flopped forward, then fell to the ground. The figure nudged it out of view, then left the screen. For a minute and a half, the camera lingered on the headless body. The pool of blood widening beneath it was the sole sign of movement. Then the camera cut to black. We could feel the realization percolating through us. What we beheld was no ordinary film. A scene that realistic could not have been faked. And gradually it dawned on us that Chris's screen debut was not the exception, but the rule. Every film we had viewed at Mescaloon's mobile cinema documented the final moments of someone's life. And we understood the price we paid for coming to see it. We spent a few seconds figuring out how to react. We'd be lying if we said we hadn't been moved. Somebody began a hesitant clap, and shortly thereafter, everybody else joined. The applause fed on itself, and grew. Some whistled. Others cheered. We were all on our feet within a minute. And Mr. Mescaloon stood beside the movie screen, and bowed, and held out his hat for the lottery drawing. None of us were picked that night. We all went out into the fields, into the crowd, and relayed what we had learned. We let the news settle over us like fog. We didn't talk about it, because there was nothing to say. Each of us mulled it over in our own personal silence. When we dispersed, all the stars in the sky glowed more brightly as we walked home. Not one of us has drawn the winning number since Crispy, all those years ago. But the night may yet come. Because, even though we know the great secret of Mescaloon's mobile cinema, we have never missed a screening. And the crowd that gathers at the edge of town for a chance to see one of Mr. Mescaloon's films is larger every time he visits. Credit to Lex Joy he visits. Credit to Lex Joy. You ever have a song pop into your head that you just didn't want to hear? Whatever song you're thinking of, mine's worse, it's Katie's song. Katie. Yeah, I knew her. The parts of my life where our paths cross flash before my eyes, Katie eyeballing me in class, Katie putting her hand on my leg on the bus, Katie and us staining each other's clothes, Katie stretching out the collar of my shirt as I pull away from her. There she is, showing up at my apartment, unannounced, uninvited, in my mind's eye the way it happened. But I don't want to see it. I shut my eyes and the images won't go away. It's 3 in the morning and I should be in bed. Katie's thinking the same thing and wants to keep me company. There's a knock at my door. My heart starts racing. Whatever this is can't be good. Good news doesn't knock on your door at 3 in the morning. I go to check the peephole knowing full well that whoever's on the other side has heard the floorboards creak. Another knock raps away. I check the peephole. It's Katie. Of course it's Katie. How'd she get in the building? I open the door. What are you doing here? I hear myself say. So, no hello? She says. Her eyes are stuck on the spin cycle. I can tell she's flying on something and it pisses me off. Aren't you going to invite me in? She says. You show up here at 3 a.m., high as the fucking moon, and you expect me to invite you in? I'm not high. I've been drinking a little. You know what? No. No? I can tell my rejection hurts her. It excites me a little. She wasn't expecting to not be let in. The thought never crossed her mind. But if I let her in now, I know that I'm implicitly telling her that it's okay to pull this shit. And once it's okay it'll happen again and again. Go home, Katie. I start to close the door but she slaps against it with an open palm. Please, she says, I can't go home. I just need a place to crash. I swear I won't bother you. That's not my problem. I don't even know you right now, I say, and the door closes. I take a look through the peephole and I can see she's just standing there stunned. She crosses her arms unsure of what to do. Some weak part of me starts to crack. She looks vulnerable, devastated. It's almost irresistible. But I need to be strong here. I have a point to prove, a valid point, an absolutely essential one. I stand by the door, listening to her heels clip-clop slowly, unsurely down the hall towards the exit door. When I hear it open and fall shut, I hit the sack. But she doesn't let me sleep. I can hear her pacing in the loose stones between my building and the one next to it. Lot of shady characters in that building. Mine's the nice one, but it hardly matters because if either one of them caught fire, the other is fucked. They're that close. And no matter how nice my building is or once was, the one closest to it taints it. Guilt by association. I lose my train of thought. Katie's phone goes off right beneath my window, that stupid ringtone, Katie's song. Why doesn't she answer it? It's cold out there, I know, and she's not exactly dressed for it. I wish she would just go away, just go home. My mind screams, nobody wants you here. But that's guilt-tripping Katie, She's just trying to make me feel bad for not letting her in. Damn ringtone, there it goes again. Christ, answer it. But she doesn't. Had enough of it, so I stick in some earplugs. They do just a good enough job to cover her pacing, disturbing loose stones. I can still hear her though. Pacing, banging and scratching against the stucco wall trying to get my attention. I can hear her muffled pleas through the window, but I only smile to myself knowing that I've won. Your guilt trips are meaningless, powerless against me. I hear Katie's song once more before drifting off with a smile on my face but wondering why she doesn't answer it. At 8 o'clock I look out my window with puffy eyes and creased skin. I can see about a half dozen people in and out of uniform in the dark, narrow space between the buildings. They're kicking up one hell of a racket, and they don't seem to care too much that they're waking everybody up because they're examining the body of a dead girl. A dead girl named Katie. She was strangled, stabbed, murdered. Looking out the window I can't unsee her lying atop the loose stones no matter how tight I close my eyes. I follow the investigation on the news. Police have no suspects. Before too long the story goes away. And all this time I've never been able to get the song out of my head. I hear it when I'm driving, I hear it when I'm working, it pops into my head in the shower, so I start humming and whistling the tune just before a shadow darts behind the curtain. And now it's 3 in the morning and I'm hearing it again with my own ears. I can hear it playing outside my window. I always hated that song, but this time it isn't driving me crazy. This time it's a banshee's cry. The chimes of a grandfather clock at the crossroads of infinity. The bell tolls for thee, the thought comes into my head from out of nowhere. This time, it makes my throat go dry. I've lived with the guilt, I say to no one in particular, isn't that enough? But the only response is Katie's song. I'm talking to myself here, but not for long. I know what's coming. I try to brace for it and will it away. But there's nothing I can do, my mind can't turn back time or turn away a ghost. And then it comes. I hear a knock at the door. Credit to Lucas Clockian. The Lewis moved into my home, our home I suppose, although it felt less than homely when filled with strangers, on November 16th without enough warning for me to adequately adjust to the change. The reality of the shifting number of occupied rooms hit forcefully and less than comfortably when I heard the sound of various carriages arriving on our driveway. I peeked out of my window atop the tower where I liked to seclude myself and watched as Father Louis, both a paternal and occupational title, ventured forth from the transport accompanied by his wife, Violet, and their daughter, Clarissa. She was young, a 9 or 10-year-old child to an early 30-something pair of parents. Their appearance was not rich, but not poor, more comfortable with room for the occasional luxury which showed in their ability to carry all their worldly possessions from the carriages into the house in 2 trips. As I observed and formed judgments, I expected to hear my name ringing through the old hallways, demanding my presence be made to greet the latest additions, and I braced myself for it, holding on to each second of solitude as if it was my last, which it surely would be with Clarissa. I made peace with the idea of her following me around constantly, demanding I read her a book or fetch her one from the shelves that she could not reach in the library, although I wasn't entirely sure if she'd been taught to read, and if not, she would request of me, with no room for refusal, that I read it aloud to her. I practiced blocking out the sound of her tantrums, stomping up the creaking wooden stairs and slamming her bedroom door so hard a painting or two would surely fall off the wall and lose its ancient, dust-covered beauty. What was odd, however, was that I had heard nothing but the Lewis voices even after the carriages and long since left the driveway. It was unusual, but I paid it no more mind than it deserved and decided that everyone must be in the grounds or in the furthest rooms away, meaning they were not made aware of the family's arrival. This opportunity was immediately taken to mean my avoidance of human contact and potential disdain towards them was allowed to continue, and so I picked up my book and continued reading. Hours went by and no one came to investigate my part of the house. I say mine because I was the only one to venture to it except when I was to be summoned, and even then my summoner would not stay long. There is a nasty chill in the air, miss, I do not like it one bit. Now please, Hurry yourself to the kitchen and let us eat by the stove so that I may shed this ghostly chill, old Mrs. Norris, our plump-as-can-be cook, would say. I found amusement in her believing the cold air to be that of a supernatural occurrence when clearly it would be due to the window being almost permanently ajar. I liked to seat myself in the bay window wrapped in blankets which kept me mostly impervious to the frosty breeze. Where some like it hot, others prefer it positively tundral. The low growling erupting from my stomach was not concealed beneath the blankets, and so, with an almost completely melted candle, I decided it was finally time to weather the storm and venture downstairs to the kitchen. With a handful of excuses, overflowing amounts of counterfeit apologies and regrets, and with just a dash of physical reflexes in case a ladle was thrown my way, I arrived at the kitchen door. Listening to the voices, I determined that the Lewis were not sat at the old but sturdy log table where I always took my meals, but instead used the dining room. This was confirmed by the piles of dusty yellow sheets piled against the wall that we used to cover the tables and chairs and there to protect them from inevitable aging. The only time the cloths were removed were when we had important guests, so it made sense that the new arrivals would think of themselves as such and wish to dine in such a place. I eavesdropped for a few moments as they ate in relative silence, occasionally one adult inquiring to the other about the tasks that were to be done over the coming days, or Clarissa asking a question she could have probably figured out the answer to herself. After coming to the conclusion that they were a nice but boring family, I reserved my ears to picking up the sound of Mrs. Norris or any other staff, but nothing was heard, and to me this was a sign to leave my introduction to the Lewis being left until the next day, as we were all tired. There are a lot of stairs up to my part of the house and many words for my brain to comprehend upon each page of my many books. Retiring myself to this decision, I quietly pushed the door to the kitchen open and sought about a bowl in which to ladle some stew into, which I then took back to my winter wonderland. However, something caught my ears and stopped me dead out of curiosity and pricked up my ears. "Father, whatever happened to that family?" Clarissa was not old enough to take note of the severity of the look between her parents. Violet's eyes made it very clear she did not wish the truth to be known to her daughter, who was not at a decently senior age to hear such details which I only knew of from overhearing the stable boy and master discussing the matter as they cleaned the stables and took the horses out for one last try before they were relocated. Bad things, sweet, bad things which you need not hear about for a long time. Father Lewis looked to his wife to determine whether he had avoided the question well enough. He was successful, at least for the first stage of questioning. But what if the bad things happen again to us? What if the bad thing comes along and it happens because I don't know what is good and what is bad, like the man in the newspaper who ate that bad plant and died because he didn't know it was bad? Clarissa made me feel old and vastly superior with her limited and repetitive vocabulary. Luckily no one heard me sigh at the fourth bad. I can assure you the bad things that happened to them will not be the end of us. You're always safe when we are around. For all of Father Lewis' shortcomings, he was surprisingly good at reassurance. I heard later he visited the patients closest to death and the local town hospital when not tending to his godly duties and helped their passing. I'm sure everyone thinks that, and yet bad things still happen. One shortcoming of the Lewis daughter was that sometimes she became very stubborn and the probability of it happening was always uncertain, except when one did not wish her to be. Violet sighed at another family dinner being dampened by her daughter wishing to know something she shouldn't. "Sweetheart, please, now is not the time to discuss such things. Today is a happy day and your father and I wish to keep it that way. How about we converse over more exciting topics? What about school? Are you excited to attend new classes?" "I suppose, but I'd be more interesting to know what happened. Clarissa, I insist you leave this conversation well alone. You are too young and need not concern yourself with the past now. Please, engage us as we wish, or finish your dinner in silence." Violet was the steadfast to Father Lewis persuadable. "Yes, Mother." Clarissa lowered her head and swirled small chunks of stew around her bowl, occasionally eating a few and waiting until a more appropriate time to bring the topic up again. The encounter assured me to not provoke Violet's short-tempered side as much as I could help it, and so I left to eat my dinner in peace before retiring for the night. The next day was spent like most others, sitting in my bay window reading my books and avoiding all human contact to the point of it becoming a game. I enjoyed the idea of seeing how long I could go without being noticed, and so resigned myself to invisibility until I was inevitably called down and scolded for my subtlety. After a morning and afternoon had gone by, I found it odd that no one had raised the alarm over my potential disappearance, but I just put it down to a simple case of all the staff being busy helping the Lewis get settled, and, seeing as I have always been the independent sort, I liked being left to my own devices, so I did not complain. Days passed much the same way, but I made sure to not be completely silent when I ventured to the more communal parts of the house, just so everyone would know I was still alive and present. On the fourth day after the Lewis arrived, it was decided that they would take a trip into the town to investigate and collect supplies, all of which I had overheard while scrounging for some breakfast. I was glad of the news, as it was nicely sunny and warm, and I wished to take a wander through the nearby forest, as I often did on the nicest days, which came few and far between sometimes, and did not wish for my experience to be marred by any immature presence asking questions. The next course of action was to hasten my way back upstairs with as little sound as possible, lest I be invited to town and have no excuse to decline, and to keep an eye out from my window until the family carriage was out of sight. My plan was going swimmingly until I heard footsteps ascending the stairs towards my door, a feeling of dread and nausea washing over me as I realized they were not familiar, for I had been in this house long enough to memorize and recognize the sound of each person's footfalls, and these being rather quiet, they therefore belonged to little Clarissa. I held my breath as I heard her wander around everywhere but my room, and just as the idea that she may get bored and leave occurred in my thoughts, she touched the door handle and it relinquished its power. I decided to let her be the startled one, which she sure was, as her eyes met upon me sat wrapped in blankets in my window, and I only paid her any mind when she ruined the silence. "Who are you?" she inquired, with no trace of manners or knowledge of how to properly address. "A resident of this house," I said with a cool tone, although I was having mixed emotions on the inside. "But we live here." She did not understand the concept of joint living, I've noticed. "My name's Clarissa." She did not seem frightened anymore, and her dismayed look turned to a friendlier disposition. "Of this I am aware." I smiled back but kept my eyes cold. More footsteps were heard coming up the stairs. "You talk funny." She giggled, and it eased me a little more. Her innocence was mildly amusing. "I'm glad you find me so entertaining." After this, Father Lewis arrived in the doorway, and his face turned to only just concealed worry as he gazed from his daughter to the slightly open window by which I was sat. "Sweetheart, what are you doing up here?" His urgency surprised me enough to close my book. The fact that he did not acknowledge my presence and introduce himself was noted too. "I was just exploring, Father. This is our new house after all." Clarissa kept smiling at me, and I found myself returning the gesture. "You cannot be up here, it's not safe." Father Lewis went to grab her hand, but she halted in place. "But you said I was always safe with you and Mother. Why is it not safe in here? Is this where the bad thing happened?" At this, my book was placed on the ledge, ready to have my attention later, as it was fully absorbed in the events unfolding in front of me. What bad thing could Clarissa possibly be referencing? "You do not need to know, just please, do not come up here, ever. We need to leave for town now, Clary, so let us go." Father Lewis tried to turn and leave, but his daughter's feet were rooted to the spot. "No, Father, I wish to know what happened to that girl in this room." "Darling, is she coming?" Violet called up from the lower level of the house, and the urgency increased exponentially in Father Lewis. "I shall tell you this and only this, Clary, and then we must leave. A young girl once lived here before us, and due to some unknown tragedy, she fell from that window and perished. Now please let us go. Your mother does not like to be kept waiting, you know that well enough." "Did she look like that girl, Father?" Clarissa pointed in my direction. Father Lewis looked directly at me, through me, yet it was like I was not there, and his horror only matched my confusion. "Clarissa, there is no one there." "Credit to WBM there." "Credit to WBM. And there, the store, called Ferocious Arms and Armory, was heavy with the scent of cured leather. Standing in front of the counter, Derek eyeballed the katana, giving each square inch the attention it deserved. Among the other gleaming weapons that hung on every wall of the shop, this one stood out. The red dragon printed on the sheath gave the sword style, and it felt good when he held it in his hands, as if the cold iron was a part of him. But it was best to consider a purchase of this magnitude with care. "Is it full tang?" "I reckon so," the old man behind the counter said, scratching at his gray facial hair. "Can it take edge-on-edge contact?" "No. No sword can. Not for long anyway. It's only in the movies that people slap swords around like that. It's a real good way to bend or break your weapon. Also, it's a $200 replica." Derek did his best to cut him a nasty look and said, "But it'll chop through. Like 3 cows, right?" The clerk rolled his eyes and gave a labored sigh. "Yeah. It'll cut through 5 or 6, and it'll really let you focus your chi to superhuman levels." The clerk rubbed his eyes with the heel of his palm. "So, are you going to buy the thing or not? The mall is about to close and you've been looking at the sword for 2 hours." "Yep, I am." Derek wasn't positive, but it seemed as if the clerk's voice dripped with sarcasm. However, he'd resolved to let it slide for the sake of getting the sword. He yanked out the money, and the greedy clerk snatched the bills from his hands, then popped open the cash register. He stuffed the money in and said, "Cool, thanks for your business, but I got to close up shop now. I got bowling tonight, and I've been late 2 times this month. The guys in my league kinda frown on that." "Whatever." Derek grabbed the sword off the counter and walked out of the store a far more dangerous man than he had ever been. He clenched the sword within his hands as he walked the 3 miles back to his place in the dark. Once he arrived at his studio apartment, he cleared the Miller High Life cans and Monarch vodka bottles off of the coffee table and replaced them with the sword. He brushed his fingertips over the blade, and it sent a chill racing down his spine. One of his major life goals, owning a samurai sword, was complete, but it came with unexpected strings attached. The forces of the undead were amassing, and he seemed to be the only one that gave a crap. It's not like the world didn't know, they just didn't care. However, that sounded about right for humanity. They were, and always had been, procrastinators, and they always wanted someone else to save them from their own stupidity. Derek, as Alice before him, would shoulder this burden and send the children of the night back into the shadows. He smiled as he assumed the lotus position on the somewhat sticky floor. He slid the sword off the coffee table and rested the blade on his lap as he said, "Dear Buddha, see that this sword is true, and guide it into the hearts of the undead. Let none stand without fear when this blade is used, and let all of the girls think it's completely awesome." Thus the sword became his holy weapon of destruction, and in a voice as deep as his vocal cords could permit he proclaimed, "I name you Fo Chopper." He raised the sword into the air, and the ceremony was almost complete. All he had to do now was christen it with undead blood, and that would come soon enough. After 3 hours of working out the sword practice videos he'd found on YouTube, he was sure no modern master could stop his speed, cunning and reflexes. He had an unnatural ability to learn the fighting arts. In fact, all he had to do was see a move once or twice and he was able to repeat it perfectly, so in his estimation he'd already mastered 6 different martial arts from YouTube and Kung Fu magazines alone. Since he'd received government funding a year ago, it allowed him to devote himself to his cause, and he would only get better and better. There was no stopping him. He cracked open a bottle of Blue Nun to celebrate, and didn't rest until it had been drained along with a few beers and a shot or 2 of vodka. When the world became too blurry from the alcohol, he crashed on top of his bed, and he couldn't help but imagine all the ways he'd use that blade to slice through the undead. The fighting would be like a perfect, yet brutal, ballet, and the night would know him by his code name forevermore. He wished to become the Dark Slayer, and that name would be on the lips of every hellish being that walked the earth. The sword lay beside him as he drifted off. The buzzing of the doorbell pulled him from the alcohol-induced coma that passed for sleep. Sure, He slept better than he had in years, but that didn't mean much as he usually only got a couple of hours in. He always felt ragged, and even with the extra sleep, he still had the hangover to contend with. Not many people came by these days, but he couldn't blame them. They wanted to keep living in their fantasy world where bad things didn't happen to good people, and the dead stayed dead. However, he wouldn't do it anymore. The more he accepted the world for the way it was, the less he could relate to others, and the more he reflected reality's harsh truths back at them, the more they feared him. It was sad, really. The lengths people would go to hide from what was going on never ceased to amaze him. The doorbell belted out its thin but insistent ring once more, and he shot from his bed. It could only be Miss Halloran, his governmental contact. He snatched the sword off of the bed and shoved it into his closet so she wouldn't see it. He didn't need any hassle about it not being a regulation weapon, and he sure as hell didn't need any flack about all the beer cans either. As an agent in training, he was not supposed to drink. However, it was the only thing that calmed him after his workouts, and it was the only way he could get any sleep. So, he grabbed the armful of cans and bottles off the coffee table and shoved them into the trash as he yelled, "Just a second." He sprinted to the small mirror on his wall and slapped his hair into shape, then rushed to the door. Derek put his eye up to the peephole, and he saw Miss Halloran's all too round face distorted by the fisheye lens of the hole. He lingered at the sight for a moment, just to make sure that no one else had followed her. Some might call it paranoid, but one could never be too careful when dealing with either the government or the undead. After a few moments of watching her pace in front of his door, he was satisfied she was still one of the good guys. His hand shot up to the deadbolt, and he unlocked the door. "Morning," she said, walking in without waiting for an invitation. She could be forward at times, but that was one of the things he liked about her. It was also one of the things he despised. "Morning," he repeated as he walked over to his sofa and plopped down. She shut the door behind her and strutted further into the room. "You haven't been to any of the meetings in a few weeks, Derek. Is everything okay?" He nodded, but said nothing. She never used his code name, and he was sure she did it just to piss him off. Although, he'd never been too adept at reading the female kind. She could have been coming on to him for all he knew. It didn't matter much to him either way. He had neither time for anger or sex. All that mattered was his first real mission, and that mission was happening tonight. Nothing would stop him from being ready. Besides, Miss Halloran, at best, could be described as frumpy. "Nope, haven't been to one in a little while." "Why not?" "We do the same shit, like, all the freaking time. I just don't get it and I hate going," he said. "Well, the others manage to show up. Every time. I don't think it can be that bad. Besides, attending those meetings is one of the things that got you here," she said, swirling her hands in the air to signal the apartment. She always had to threaten his funding. It was the first place she went to get him to do as she wanted, and she knew he couldn't say no. However, he wasn't going to give up without at least a little fight. "The government has billions of dollars, and the best they can do is toss to me a one-room apartment in the shittiest part of town. I'm not too impressed with the way they treat their people." Her face scrunched into a mix of exasperation and disgust as he spoke. They'd played this game too many times, and he knew what was going to come next. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small white bag and tossed it onto the coffee table. The bag rattled as it slid across the table and came to a stop on his pack of camels. "You got to keep up with everything if you want it to stay like this." "I have been." He scratched at his stubble and continued, "Everything's been hard lately, but I said I'd keep your rules and I'm a man of my word." "I know you are, so could you just come to the meetings like you promised?" "Yeah. Whatever, Miss Halloran." She hated it when he called her Miss, but that was why he did it so often. "I'm not trying to be mean, but I feel you should use my proper title. I like you. However, we need to keep our roles clear." She glanced down at the floor and said, "I've stuck my neck out for you. I know, and I'm going to make you proud. I just need more time." She put her hands on her hips and sighed, "Okay, you can skip the next one, but you need to come to all the rest. I mean it. I'll be there. Okay. I'm going to leave you alone for now. I'll be back tomorrow so we can have a little more substantial talk." She looked around the room and grimaced. "Also, clean this place up. It smells like feet in here." "Sounds good. Let me know if you need any help." She opened the door and walked out. He spent that afternoon organizing his gear for his first mission. His nunchucks, throwing stars, wood stakes and homemade pipe bombs were either placed in his bag or on his tack vest, and when night fell he'd be ready for the gathering of the undead that was happening that night. Because he was taking action without clearance from Halloran, he was risking everything, but there were too many traitors within the organization's ranks to trust them with any of the details of his mission. It was going to be a sticky situation no matter what, but if he could take down a nest as large as the one he found by himself, they'd be forced to make him a full agent. He glanced down at the paper bag she tossed on the coffee table, and he snatched it up and stuck it in the tack vest. If something bad happened tonight he needed to be able to at least pretend he was playing by some of their rules when they pulled him in. As night fell, the Dark Slayer, crouched in the trees outside the green two-story house at the end of Maple Avenue. The house itself was nice, at least, nicer than the mobile home he grew up in as a kid, but underneath it all was the stink of the undead. There were already 5 or 6 vamps in the house, and they sometimes glared out the windows looking for their comrades or checking for security threats. However, he was too well hidden in the dew-soaked underbrush that grew wild on the far left side of the house. As he crouched in the darkness, the damp and cold night air bit into him like a wild animal. It would have been more bearable if he'd wore more than his black sleeveless Metallica shirt. However, it was important that the vamps saw how ripped he was when he made his assault. His biceps were a powerful form of psychological warfare, and he needed to use every tool in his arsenal to take them down. He'd trained a long time for this, and a little cold weather couldn't stop him. He'd showed the organization he meant business, and they'd have to let him join. Hell, he'd come so far from where he started, and he'd shown too much gumption to be turned down now. At one time he'd been just like everyone else. He'd once thought the existence of vampires to be little more than a myth, but a documentary on the History Channel last Halloween showed him otherwise. At first the show just talked about boring historical stuff, but towards the end it brought on a few actual vampires. They were tall, nerdy-looking things, but underneath he could tell they were pure evil. They were dressed all in black, and even the men wore fingernail polish and lipstick, as if they were girls. The thought that people knew these creatures of the night roamed the streets ground on his nerves. He had begun his search for vampires soon after he'd seen the show, and it didn't take long to find them. They didn't even cover their tracks. For God's sake, they had websites, and still no one did a thing to stop them. He didn't read much of the site's contents, but they had pictures all over them. He couldn't believe they could be so bold. But, the wicked often were, and that was the problem with the world. Evil gets right in everyone's face and no one stands up to it, but the Dark Slayer wasn't like everyone else. He was a man of action, and most of that action tonight would come from his razor-sharp, and completely bitching, samurai sword. This particular nest of vampires he'd found by accident while looking for research material at Wilson's Comics. The Dark Slayer wasn't much of a reader. He preferred to conduct his research in graphic novel form. Wilson's was a small place packed to the brim with cardboard boxes full of old comics and other things nerds like, and the musty pages of the books made the place reek. He didn't like the store much, but it was better than reading a Time Life book or a web page. So he'd been going for weeks just to gather information about the undead, and they had mountains of data on the subject. He couldn't believe his eyes as he walked into the store one dreary December night. The vamp was a little worm of a kid with thick-rimmed glasses, and his meekness made the Dark Slayer instantly aggressive. However, he contained the power within, and he let the kid be. After all, the Dark Slayer is a protector of the weak and helpless. But his Gentile stance was misguided. What lurked within that boy was pure evil, and he was ashamed his keen hunter instincts didn't pick up on it from the start. "Hey, "Wilson, you mind if I put this up on your board?" the kid asked the goofy shop owner. The kid's voice was as high-pitched as glass being chopped up in a blender, and that's when Derek discovered two things. 1, the kid was a vampire, and 2, that vampirism most likely stunts puberty. "What is it?" Wilson's fat lips flapped. "A vampire LARP, the undead monster said." "Yeah, whatever." The vampire trotted over to the cluttered bulletin board and pinned up a self-printed advertisement. The poster was black except for the picture at the top of an open mouth with fangs and bright red font that appeared to be dripping blood. The flyer spelled out their diabolical agenda as clear as possible, saying, "All undead are welcome to the first annual Undead LARP. Come one come all, and we'll have ourselves a vampire ball. We play the Gathering or other White Wolf types of systems." In smaller block letters underneath it stated, "It starts at 7 p.m. January 14th. Call 907-347-2254 for further details or simply show up at 326 Maple Avenue, the sign will be out front by the mailbox. Just knock on the door." It was as if liquid nitrogen had been injected into Derek's veins, but he played it cool. He couldn't let the enemy see his distress. After the vamp left, he ripped down the sheet and just glared at it for a while. When the incredible weight of all its implications rolled off of him, he marched up to the store owner with the leaflet clenched in his fists and tossed it at him. "What the hell is this?" the Dark Slayer shouted. "Yo, dude, what up? What up? Are you one of them?" "Hell, no, I've never LARPed a day in my life. If you ever accuse me of that again, you can just get the hell out of my store." "I don't believe it." "Dude, calm down. They're good loyal customers, and they're just holding their little nerd party." "Nerd party?" "Yeah, they just go there and have a good time. I don't give a crap what they do. It's weird to me, but to each his own. I mean, they spend a lot of cash in here, so I'll tolerate a little weirdness from them. It's all just nerd pretend, dude." Wilson tossed the leaflet back at Derek, and it hit him in the chest and rolled to the floor. The question as to why vampires wanted to pretend to be nerds was a mystery to Derek, but he'd had too much of the collaborator known as Wilson to care. He snatched the paper off the ground and stormed off. That's how he'd come to the house on Maple Avenue, and he'd finish what he'd started. He'd been hiding in the woods for nearly 3 hours, and his hand was starting to ache from the stranglehold he kept on the faux chopper's hilt. Derek didn't like to admit it, but the cold was getting to him. He pried his hands off the hilt of the sword and shoved them into his tack vest. He wasn't trying to warm them, just looking for his bottle of rum. When his hands found the plastic bottle, Derek jerked it out, and along with it came the bag Miss Halloran had given him. He snatched up the bag, ripped it open and pulled out the small amber bottle that lay within. Even in the dark, he could make out the horrid black letters printed on it. Thorazine. Dr. Halloran. Take orally, initial dose, 25 mg 3 times daily. He popped open the bottle and dropped a few of the pills to the ground. When the organization took him back in, he wanted to be able to say he'd at least taken some of them. As the pills hit the dead leaves carpeting the woods, a rusted-out red van pulled into the driveway, and vamps piled out, dressed as if they'd taken fashion advice from Morticia Adams. All wore black and held cases of beer, bags of chips, or bottles of wine. There were about 5 of them in all, and slithering among them was the same gaunt nerdy vampire he'd seen at the comic shop. The Dark Slayer slammed what was left of his rum and tossed the bottle to the ground. Clenching the hilt of his sword, he sprang from the underbrush. The Dark Slayer sprinted across the lawn and into the yellow glow of the floodlights. One of the vampires, posing as a young teen girl, spotted him as he closed in on his target. She pointed and let out a scream. Her eyes were wide and a look of terror was slapped across her face. Derek jumped over a flower bed and onto the driveway. The hard rubber soles of his Vietnam jungle boots clacked on the asphalt as he rushed towards the target. Despite the girl's screams, the poor bastard never saw it coming, and with one quick strike the sword slashed into the back of the nerdy vampire. The vamp let out a low whine as the Dark Slayer brought the sword down again, and he smacked the top of his head. Blood gushed from his wounds as the vamp crashed to the ground, and cries of fright rose from the lips of every undead soul that stood there. Derek had caught them off guard, and now they were going to be chopped into pieces, along with the rest of the vamps in the house. Miss Dr. Halloran would be shocked at how good he was when she saw this. If she wasn't, it just meant she was a sympathizer. The end. Credit to Jeremy Bennett. End. Credit to Jeremy Bennett. End. Credit to Jeremy Bennett. First it was the gays. Then the Muslims. Then the terrorists. Then the gay terrorist Muslims. I don't know. It's hard to keep track of who you're meant to be hating when you're a straight, white male. I put that as my Facebook status once. 34 likes. I felt like kind of a big deal. In a world so oversaturated with attention addicts, I don't see the issue with indulging in the odd hit of pure, uncut validation once in a while. It's a good rush. There was a time when I thought the whole idea of social networking was juvenile. I saw every tweet, blog entry and status update as a child hanging from the monkey bars shouting at their mother for not looking. I'm not above that. No one is above that. Grow up. What does that even mean? At what age are you meant to stop enjoying positive reinforcements? Is growing up synonymous with being a jaded cynic? Forget that. Validate me. I'm going to be dead one day. Tell me that my observations are witty and relevant. Retweet me. Reblog me. I walk through crowds, tangent and clothed, yet invisible and unimportant. Just like the rest of you. Some of you peacock to get a second glance. A real-life Facebook like. Let's all peacock and blend in together, right? 7 retweets, 26 likes. No one will remember your name. They will all remember mine. I catch the 5:15 train home and rarely get a seat. The train ride home is the only time it is socially acceptable to grind on strangers. 5 retweets, 17 Facebook likes. I return home from work at around 5:45 every weekday, lock the front door, finish the last of my commutable cappuccino and place the cup in the recycling bin. I remove my tie and drape it over the coat hanger on my living room door. I undo the top button of my $8.99 shirt and breathe a sigh of relief that the working day is done. I pull my iPhone from my pocket and scroll absently for around 5 minutes and then I head to the basement. It's quite a nice basement. It's spacious and insulated. The floor is laminated and kept clean and the walls are decorated with art prints and watercolor canvases. I paint some of them. Check out my Instagram when all of this is over, maybe you'll like them. The smell isn't great down there sometimes but that's a means to an end. I can deal with the smell. Soundproofing. That's the important part. After entering my basement, I turn right and head to the far wall. There will always be 2 objects of interest that I approach. One of them will usually be moving, the other one silent. With my iPhone still in hand, I open the camera and hold it landscape, tapping the screen to gain focus. I take several shots just to make sure that I get a good one and then I lock the screen again. The one that moves usually begs me to let them go. They bargain and they plead. Sometimes they come on to me. I gesture to the silent and still one tied up next to them. I pull out the swollen, black tongue and turn the gaunt, lifeless face towards them and remind them what they are. All that they are. It doesn't matter how many followers you have on Twitter when you're tied to a radiator in my basement. 12 retweets. I wish I could see their faces when they find out. I make the live one watch as I fill the small bathtub in the corner with lye. I make them watch as I untie the dead one and drag them over to the tub and slide them in. I then leave the 2 of them together overnight. By the morning, all that's left is a brownish, black sludge and a few brittle bones. It's always too much for the live one to stomach. I tell them again, it's all that they are. Sex, gender, race, religion, whatever. They all look the same after a night in my tub. I have been documenting the whole thing from the start. Just a few more and my blog can go live. I don't know what to call it yet. Social macabre? Maybe? I don't know. I'm going to be critical of whatever name I choose. Either way, once I share it, the internet is going to explode. I'll be viral. A social media pandemic infecting the feeds and personal profiles of people all over the world. They'll forget the names of my art pieces, but they will remember my name. I might even get my own hashtag. Credit to Radarshine. A few months ago I was busy preparing to move to a new house when I came across something from my past. I was going through my belongings, trying to figure out what to keep and what to discard, when I found an old shoebox stuffed down the back of my closet. Curious, I opened it up and found that it was full of CDs. I flipped through them and realized that these were backups of files from over 10 years ago. I remembered that this was how I used to back up stuff before external hard drives became affordable enough for me to just start backing up with them. I stopped packing and started checking out the CDs on my computer. They were mostly full of stuff I'd collected off of the net, like MP3s, ROMs and animated GIFs. I then came across a CD that was labeled Conversations with Pun. I stared at the CD with some reservation for a moment before loading it into my computer. The CD contained a bunch of images, a couple of audio files and some text dumps from a message board. Looking over these files made me recall an incident that had occurred many years ago. It was an incident that had slipped from my mind until I saw that CD again. Honestly, I was glad to have forgotten about it. It was a pretty freaky experience, and to this day I still don't know what to make of it. It was 2004, I was in my last year of high school and I spent most of my free time being an admin for an emulation message board. It wasn't a particularly taxing job. I was one of 3 guys who were admins and the board itself was pretty niche, so we usually didn't get a great deal of traffic. Back then there wasn't the bot problems you find on boards these days. Most of the time I just had to log in, check my messages, then browse through the forums to see if anyone was breaking any rules or just being a dick. It was a pretty fun gig. I got the most enjoyment out of messing with persistent trolls. Being an admin allowed me to change their avatars. I had pics of crying babies for such occasions, or edit their posts. Usually I'd have them say stuff like "I suck, I cry into my pillow at night," or my personal favorite, "I left my brain in the womb." Basically I used to get a real kick out of administrating justice on the board. So one night a new guy registered to the forum and created a thread called "Need Help to Pull Apart My NES." The following is from that thread. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 1. I was slightly mystified by his question and I had some time to kill, so I thought I'd ask him. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 2. I almost laughed at this. I explained to Pawn what ROMs were and he got really excited. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 3. I got the gist that he really wasn't very technically savvy. Which was fair enough, we all had to start from somewhere. After explaining to him about ROMs and emulators, I didn't hear back from him for a few days. He then came back to the board and became a bit of a regular. He would mostly start threads in which he was asking questions about emulation problems he was having. A lot of people didn't have any time for him. They felt that he was just an annoying person who asked dumb questions. I remember one night he started a thread about how he couldn't get an emulator to read games he had downloaded. We then had to explain to him what a zip file was and how it worked. One of the other admins was thinking of banning him. He didn't like the fact that Pawn was starting up new threads about stuff that had been already answered in earlier threads. I told him not to do that. I'd have a word with Pawn. I don't know why I decided to step in. I sort of felt bad for the kid, I guess. I also felt a bit of a connection to him because he was one of the few people I'd run across who was also a fan of the rebounds per game Suikoden. So I told Pawn to check through the board before posting any questions that might have already been asked and answered. I then told him if he got really stuck to just private message me. It wasn't long before he started messaging me. At first he would just ask me questions. Lots of questions. Fortunately he seemed to be a quick study. I didn't find myself having to explain things to him over and over again. So I wouldn't say he was stupid, just green. Soon enough he asked me for some game recommendations, and this led to us talking about what games we were playing. It was from there that we started having a correspondence over the next few months. We only really talked about games and movies though. The only personal stuff that I knew about him was that he was 16 and he lived in London. One night we were having a conversation about Metroid games. I'd just clocked Super Metroid for the millionth time and was thinking about dusting off the original Metroid and giving that a go. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 4. It was a pretty well-known glitch. Basically how it works is, if you are falling down a long shaft in some places in the game and then press the select button repeatedly really fast, you can make wall tiles disappear. If you go through the tunnel that is created, you'll end up outside the map. You can then find rooms that are tile swaps of regular rooms, rooms that scroll repeatedly forever, and rooms that look like they have been randomly thrown together. Apart from using it to sequence break, it's pretty pointless. It's more of a novelty than anything else. Some people started up a website devoted to the secret worlds. They were obsessed with mapping the whole thing out. Like they were explorers braving uncharted territory or something. Advertisement. I tried it out myself once on my Game Boy. I quickly got frustrated though after I kept getting stuck in walls when I moved between rooms. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 5. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 6. I didn't hear from Pon for a couple of days after that. Then one night he sent me a message. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 7. I taught Pon how to take snapshots and upload them so that he could show me the stuff he was finding. A few days later I got a message. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds -8. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 9. After that I didn't hear from him for about a week. Then one night I was on the message board and got the following message. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 10. Pon sent me the links and I looked over the images he had uploaded. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 11. I knew straight away that this wasn't a glitch. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 12. I asked him where he had got the ROM from and he gave me the address. When I checked it out, the page wasn't there anymore. Which wasn't really surprising. Back then ROM websites were frequently popping up and being taken down almost immediately. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 13. Just before I was about to go to bed I looked at the pictures again. It occurred to me that the words might form a sentence. I wrote the words down on a piece of paper and started trying out combinations. Eventually I came up with, "How dare you? Stop stealing my legacy." I thought it was a rather strange sentence. I couldn't figure out why anyone would even bother hacking that message into the game. I didn't even understand what it meant. A few days later I got another message from Pon. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 14. I taught Pon how to capture the audio and gave him my email address. I told him to attach the file there if he did manage to record any sounds from the game. I thought about what Pon had described to me and I had to admit that I was pretty impressed by the hack. I also agreed with Pon's reasoning. If someone had bothered to put this much effort in, then it was likely that they had done more. It was just a matter of finding it. Though I was surprised that I had never heard of the hack before. I started browsing through ROM hack sites, trying to find the one that Pon was playing. I didn't have any luck, so I asked around in a few IRC channels, but no one had seen anything like what I was describing. Bite the bullet sponsored links you may like. 10 countries that don't want you to visit. Board articles. The following night I was browsing the message board when I noticed I had a new private message. I saw that it was from Pon and opened it up. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 15. The audio file finished downloading and I listened to it while I waited for Pon to come back. 5th player src equals youtube.com web link. I didn't know what to make of it. I'd never heard a Game Boy make that kind of sound before. At first it just sounded to me like a foghorn, but then another sound started to play over the top of the foghorn noise. The other sound did seem familiar to me somehow, but I couldn't quite place it. I found myself getting spooked, so I quickly closed the file. I got up and made myself a cup of coffee and a snack. By the time I got back to my computer, 15 minutes had passed. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 16. I waited a few more minutes but I didn't get a response from Pawn. I got worried for a moment but then just figured either a friend or a family member had come by and he was busy. I surfed the net for a bit, did some admin duties, then checked my messages again. Pawn still hadn't come back. I was pretty tired by that point, so I shut down my computer and went to bed. I got up early the next day and checked to see if Pawn had left me a message. He still hadn't gotten back to me. I headed off for school and didn't get home till the evening. After I grabbed a bite to eat, I sat in front of the computer and checked my email and private messages. There was still nothing from Pawn. I left a few more messages and waited for his response. Over the next few days he still didn't get to me and I really started to freak out. I skipped school for a few days and stuck pretty close to my computer. One afternoon, after performing some minor admin duties, I re-listened to the sound that Pawn had sent me. I still couldn't make out what it was, so I started playing around with it in Sound Recorder. I sped it up a few times and realized that the foghorn sound might be the music that plays right before you fight the Metroid Queen. As I continued to speed the sound file up, I realized what the other sound was. Someone was talking over the music. I had to speed the sound up over 10 times to get it to sound like it was playing at the right speed. Once I had done that, I tried to make out what the voice was saying. I had to listen carefully a few times before I got it. 5 player src equals youtube.com web link. The first part was an introduction. Someone was saying "I am." And after that was presumably their name. I couldn't catch what it was though. It wasn't an English name. The second part of the sentence was clear enough though. Knock knock, I am here. Needless to say, I was quite unnerved at that point. I hit the internet again, trying to find out anything I could about the version of Metroid 2 that Pawn had been playing. I emailed people at the Secret Worlds website, I posted messages on numerous emulation websites, and I spoke to people on various IRC channels. Most people though I was joking, the rest thought I was crazy. Advertisement. It seemed no one knew what the hell I was talking about. Then one night I got a private message. Metroid 2, Secret Worlds, 17. I was a bit startled. When I'd been going around asking questions about Metroid 2, I hadn't been using Pesmergna as my username. Nor had I mentioned what message board I was from. I replied back to the message, wanting to know who was messaging me and how they had found me. But the user never got back to me. After that night I kept an eye on the logs of user activity to see if he came back to the site, but he never did. I then took the message's advice and looked up the name Gunpei Yokoi. It didn't take me long to find out who he was. It turns out that he was hugely influential at Nintendo. Some of the games he worked on included the original Donkey Kong, Mario Bros., Kid Icarus, Metroid and Metroid 2. But what he is best known for is arguably his greatest creation, the Game Boy. It's often described as his legacy. I kept reading the article in fascination when I got to a section that was about his life after leaving Nintendo. Not long after he left Nintendo and started his own company, Gunpei Yokoi died in a car accident. I glanced at the date of his death and that gave me a shock. It was October the 4th, 1997. The same day that I got my last message from Pawn. I listened to the sped-up version of the audio Pawn had sent me, and that's when I knew that the first part of the message was "I am Gunpei Yokoi." It was after this realization that I went through a period, which went on for about a year, in which I flat out refused to answer a door unless the person identified themselves. Over the next few months I scoured the internet for any news stories concerning a missing teenager in London. There were several stories that would pop up, but the details were so vague that any one of them, or none of them, could have been Pawn. There was one story that did catch my attention. It was about a missing teenager who had been last seen at home. His mother had left for work and she said that he had been on the computer in the lounge room. When she returned several hours later, the lounge room was empty, but the computer and various other electrical appliances were still turned on. At first she thought that he might be in another part of the house, but when she checked she found that it was empty. She then tried to call his mobile phone, and that was when she discovered that his phone and wallet were by the computer. It was at this point that she called the police. They investigated and found no sign of disturbance in the house, and nothing was missing, well, except for the teenager. He had vanished without a trace. I looked for more information online but couldn't find anything else. I contemplated getting in touch with the police in London. But one thing stopped me: there was no way I could think to word my story without sounding like a crazy person. Even if I could figure out how to word it properly, and if this missing teen did happen to be Pawn, there was no information that I could give them that they wouldn't get off of his computer anyway. And if it wasn't Pawn, then I would just be wasting their time and possibly end up in some sort of legal trouble. The words hindering a police investigation popped into my mind. I went back through my conversations with Pawn to see if there were any clues to his real identity that I hadn't noticed before. But there was nothing there that revealed anything I didn't already know about him. It was then that I realized that I always just assumed that he was a he in the first place. But there was nothing in our conversations to dismiss the possibility that Pawn had been a female. The possibility of Pawn being female instantly made the task of finding Pawn twice as hard. In the end I had to give up. I just didn't know what I could possibly do. I took screenshots of all of my conversations with Pawn, copied the pics and sound files he had emailed me, and burnt them onto a CD, just in case I ever needed them again. Not long after that I finished high school and then started working. Within a month I stopped being an admin. I still stuck around the board for a few more months, but by then I no longer had the free time to post with any regularity. Over the following years I got busy with life, and everything that happened with Pawn drifted further and further from my mind. I decided to write this all down and put it online in the hopes that after all these years someone might know something about what happened to Pawn, or know of the version of Metroid 2 that he found. As I said at the beginning, I honestly don't know what to make of this. Is there a copy of Metroid 2 floating around the internet that's haunted by the ghost of Gunpei Yokoi? And if you have the misfortune to stumble across it, does he come to your door, angry that you have dared to defile his legacy? I try not to think too much about it. When it does cross my mind now, I like to imagine that the whole thing was an elaborate hoax perpetuated by Pawn. That he set the whole thing up months in advance. He created the images and the audio files. He came onto the message board, pretending to be a technically inept teenager, when really he was brilliant with a PC. He was user 12345, he was the one who told me to look up Gunpei Yokoi. I like to imagine that he is somewhere out there, still laughing about the wonderful joke he pulled all those years ago. Sometimes I can almost convince myself that it was just a hoax. I think that was how I was able to get to sleep at night in the months after I lost contact with Pawn. And I think that telling myself that it was all a hoax now is going to come in real handy on those restless nights in the days to come. Credit to Uberneck Lord. Credit to Uberneck Lord. Credit to Uber